Welcome to the House of Wisdom, a new podcast for book talks on the Middle East and more. Today, my guest is Jenny White, a professor of anthropology at Stockholm University in Sweden and a most accomplished writer on Turkish history and culture. I know it's rare to find a great scholar and a wonderful storyteller in one soul, and I deeply admire Jenny's unique combination of the two. The meticulous academic research and storytelling have been realized in her new graphic novel, Turkish Kaleidoscope, which was just released by the Princeton University Press 2 weeks ago. The book tells the stories of 4 college students during the 1970s as they navigate a society on the verge of a civil war. Jenny, congratulations on your book and welcome to the House of Wisdom.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. I'm glad to be here.
I was truly enjoyed, and it was really a pleasure to read your book. You were a student at Hacettepe University in Ankara in 1975, and you narrate this event at Hacettepe in 1975, going, before and after, to shed light on what was going on the rest of the country. So could you please tell your story first?
Okay, it's not as interesting as the story in the book, but so I should start with my study abroad when I was in college in Germany, because that's how I ended up in Turkey. One of the messages of this book is that life is very contingent. It's not like you plan something and you end up there. These things happen. So this happened to me in a dormitory in Germany where I was doing study abroad, and I found I couldn't make friends with the German students for some reason. But there were some Turks in the dormitory, and I'd never met any Turks before, but they were very friendly. One of them taught me how to cook. And in the end, I went back to the States and finished my undergraduate degree, and I had learned about a very good program at Hacettepe University in Turkey in cross-cultural social psychology, which is what I was majoring in, what I was interested in. And I just decided to go. And I stayed with a family. But to go back to the contingency, I often wonder what would have happened if there was one friendly German in the dormitory. My entire life would have been different. So I just ended up in this contingent way in Turkey in 1975 to start a master's at Hacettepe University, which was officially actually in Turkish. The language of the university was in Turkish, but the professors in the department were very, very good, very famous psychologists, and they you had to speak fluent English to get in. So when I was there, we read all English materials, and then the conversation was in English. It was only when I got to the thesis that I realized it had to be in Turkish, and that was like 3 years later. I was like, oh my God. But we managed it somehow. So that's how I ended up there. And when I went, I had no idea about anything. Of course you're young, you're like, oh, this is so exciting. And I thought that there was something strange when I got off the plane in Ankara, because, you go down the stairs from the plane and there's this huge tank-like thing sitting there with a gun pointed at you. And I now, of course, know that it's armored personnel carrier. But it was like right there by the stairs to guard us or something as we came out. And anyway, so it was a kind of learning experience for me in a lot of ways, because I also didn't know anything about Turkish society or culture. It was pre-internet. You couldn't really easily look things up. And I had no idea that there was pretty much a civil war going on, which I discovered very soon, because one day I was carrying my laundry down a boulevard to the family. I had moved out, but I was still doing laundry at the family's house, and that I was staying with, and I was in a crowd of people and they were chanting something. And of course, I didn't know any Turkish, so I didn't know what they were chanting. But apparently, they were chanting Washington, Washington. It's like, my laundry. And I saw more of these armed personnel carriers lined up in front, like, I don't know, two or three, I can't remember. Anyway, everyone stopped and I stopped and I looked at them and I thought, oh, that's interesting. You know, in American, you never think they're going to move, right? So they actually started charging into the crowd and someone pulled me aside at the last second and kind of threw me into a doorway with my laundry. And then I took off running down a side street, and these things followed me. Like one of them, they jump on the sidewalk. They're kind of like roaches, you know, they can move very quickly all over the place. It's like something I'll never forget. I was like, what the hell is going on here? And then, you know, I didn't really know anyone who would tell me these things. I wasn't at the university yet. Once I got to the university, of course, then, you know, people clued me in. So it was very, very violent at Hacettepe University. I was out on the new campus in Beytepe, which had just been built. So it was like way outside of town in those days, and there was a bus connecting them. Unlike Middle East Technical University, which was right next to us, which was mostly leftist students, Hacettepe was half and half. So they would be like shooting each other in the halls. There are a couple of scenes in the book that I actually experienced. Like one day I came to school, I got off the bus, I went down the corridor to the psychology department, and I smacked into a wall. And I was like, wait a second, there was a corridor here yesterday. What happened? So apparently the students were shooting each other, so they just put up a wall so that I guess the people in the departments were shooting at each other.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
my generation knows these stories from our parents. Widespread violence touched most of our relatives' lives. My mother's youngest brother, for example, he was shot at the age of 16, and he was not on either side, just a bystander on the street, and no one knows where that bullet came. Aside from the fact that most of these events touched our families, and it's so important for most of the Turks and Kurds. What made you work on a book on the 1970s?
Well, that's a really good question because I never thought about doing a book about the 70s for some reason. So I wrote a book about the 80s, one about the 90s, one about the 2000s. And now suddenly I thought, okay, I need to go back to the 1970s. And the impetus for that was that, you know, after the 1980 coup that shut down all of this violence, I went back. I left in 1978. I went back in 1983 after the martial law was ended and there was a new election, and I didn't recognize the country. You know, it was colorful. It was like all kinds of export import, whereas before there really wasn't much chance for Turks to travel outside or for products to come in, and people tended to wear dark clothing in part because it was very polluted and it was easier to keep clean that way. So it was just this like blast of color, and nobody, even my friends, would talk about the 1970s. It was as if it never happened. It was really weird. And so there was this repression, really. It wasn't even a forgetting. It was repressed for, I don't know, almost 40 years. There were some memoirs that came out, mostly later in the 90s. And there was some kind of Cold War type analyses where people, you know, would study the political platforms or what politicians did and the parties and the ideologies of the different groups that were shooting at each other. You know, so it was a different kind of analysis that really didn't grasp what I thought I had experienced. And then there were, suddenly it appeared maybe 10, 15 years ago, there started to be the 1970s started to appear in television movies and things like that, as kind of, oh, wasn't it wonderful? We could wear mini skirts and no Islamists breathing down our necks. And, I don't remember anything like that. So, of course, I was in Ankara and not Istanbul. Maybe that makes some of a difference. But in any case, the final straw was when I think it was 2012. There was a trial of the generals, the surviving generals who carried out the 1980 coup, and there was a whole bunch of people who came to testify at the trial about how this had, what happened to them after the coup and how this had destroyed their lives. And, it really is, it was a whole lost generation there where people were not only killed, but they were exiled, tortured, they lost their jobs and were never able to go back to their professions. They're just, a whole generation of people whose lives, or more subtly, they were unable to finish their degrees, right? That happens to at least one of the characters in the book. The violence was so intense that you couldn't actually move forward with your life. Even though people tried, they got married, they fell in love, they had children, but it was always there. So what struck me at these trials was that all these people came forward and their stories started in 1980. They started with the coup, right? So they became the victims. But before that, there were lots of perpetrators of various kinds. And none of that really has been chewed through. So I thought that somebody should do some kind of social history of that period. But it can't just be me. I was a foreigner. I have one particular point of view. So I went ahead and I did oral history interviews with.
I want to ask, actually, it's obvious that you gathered a lot of rich data. And could you please just tell us, how did you collect the data? What were your strategies a bit?
Well, my strategy was to get as many diverse people as possible to talk to me about this period, because obviously there are lots of people who lived through this period. And I wanted to get people on the right and the left. And I wanted to get men and women, people who were leaders, and also people who were like your relatives, bystanders, and it was impossible at the time not to be involved. You had to be on one side or the other, or else, as one of the characters says, are you crazy? Both sides will beat you up. Who will protect you, right? So people just got sucked in, and damaged, their lives damaged, or they're physically damaged as a result. So I basically rattled the tree of my connections, which after, what is it, like 30 or 40 years of doing research, I have lots of connections. And I asked people for just names of people who will talk to me, and went to talk to them. And I also wanted, in terms of diversity, so I have Muslim, non-Muslim, worker, craftsman, factory worker, factory owner, people who were elite, people who were from working class backgrounds, people who were in different parts of Turkey at the time, not just all in Istanbul or Ankara. So not just college students, people who were college students. So there's this, it's like a triangulation. You try to get as many angles on this situation as possible. So
That's
yeah.
it's apparent that it's so rich. So why the metaphor of kaleidoscope?
Well, so the other thing that happened was that about 5 years ago or so, when I was in Turkey, somebody I don't even know, right, asked me when they discovered that I was working on the 1970s, asked me, do you think that what happened in the 1970s could happen again now? And was very concerned, a sort of, elderly man. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, one of the things that I noticed in doing all these different kinds of research, they're not all on violence, but much of my research has been on politics, right? So there's still an undercurrent of violence that comes out in different ways. I mean, obviously violence against women, violence against Kurds, but also just daily violence. Don't, you looked at me wrong, kind of masculine violence that I've witnessed that a number of times. So um, there's like an undercurrent of it, and I was kind of curious about that. And also, the other thing that keeps happening is that Turkey just seems to be in every decade, in every generation, there seem to be fracturing, and the groups are not the same groups that there were in the 70s. I mean, you can have left and right, but I'm not really sure what they mean anymore. Now you have other labels on the different groups who hate each other with the same intense emotion as the groups did in the 70s. And, so that's this intense emotion is also one of the characteristics that keeps continuing and that is the substrate for violence also. Um, so I was just curious about all of these things, and this is why I went back to write this book, to try to figure out why does this keep happening? It's kind of like Groundhog Day. You wake up, and then the kaleidoscope image is, there's a description of what is a kaleidoscope at the beginning of the book, right? It's like you look through and there's some object at the end, but there are mirrors inside, so it refracts, so that they're the same objects, but they look different depending on how the mirrors are refracting. Then you can add some colored bits or color at the front and then make even more patterns. But the objects are the same. So they're like these patterns that I see refracted through time. Anyway, and also there's the image of in 1980, the political system in Turkey was so out of whack that it really was like a kaleidoscope, with these there was no party in charge, so there were these coalitions, and then they would, you turn the wheel of the kaleidoscope and the coalitions would fall into a different pattern, and then everything would change. They would replace, if the Rightists were, political parties were on top, they would get certain ministries, and then all of the tea serving men, the chajis in that ministry, all the way down to the bottom, would be switched out for sort of right-wing thugs. And then the kaleidoscope would turn again, and then the leftists would take over, and they would kick out all of the rightist teachers and then replace them with their own people. So it was just like this continuing shuffling.
Yes. So, in terms of your choice about the graphic novel, so what were the pros and cons of writing a graphic novel when you compare your own experience of writing historic fiction?
Well, it was equally hard, I want to say that, and as hard as writing scholarly stuff. This book took 8 years because you had to get grant proposals. You have to get grants to do the research, then to pay the artist, and it just goes, on and on. So basically, the amount of effort doesn't change. The only difference, I guess, is for writing fiction, you don't need a grant to go and do the research necessarily. You could just sit in your little room and make things up. Although in my historical work, fiction, I try to be as accurate as possible. And if I'm not accurate, invariably, as soon as the book is published, someone calls me up or sends me an irate email saying, "This building that you say was here was not there in 1887." So you always have to be on your toes no matter what you're doing. But I didn't know that I was going to be doing a graphic novel when I did the interviews, right? This was a scholarly project, and I was planning to write, an academic book about the 1970s and what it can tell us about today. So when I did the interviews, I realized right away there was something special about this. This is very different from my experience doing ethnographic research, where ethnographic research, it's kind of daily conversation or politicians talking to each other, dealing with constituents, and you're there like a big ear and you write it all down. But this was very intense because people were reliving the experience as they were telling me about it. And I realized that they were very young in those days, like I was, late teens, early 20s, and this was a period of great transformation for them. And so I got like coming of age stories, or some little thing that happened that was made a huge turning point in their lives, including their political lives. A T-shirt or a telescope or something, some object, a book. And the intensity of people talking, they really, really wanted someone to listen to this. And I did when I finished doing the interviews, and I went back and I did some analyses of looking for patterns in the interviews. There were lots of these patterns that were very clear, actually. And I wrote a couple of articles about that. And then I realized I'm losing the stories. The stories get flattened. So I was writing about factionalism, but in fact, I was losing the stories of factionalism that made the whole thing come alive. So I approached Princeton University Press, which had published my previous book, Islamist Mobilization. No, Muslim nationalism. Yeah, Islamist. Yeah, Muslim nationalism. So they, to my big surprise, encouraged me to do a graphic book. And I had thought, well, I could maybe do a scholarly book with some pictures or somehow get the stories in there. But they said, no, we can't sell an in-between book. Right? There's no market for it. You have to either write a scholarly book with maybe some pictures, or you could do something else. And they sent me the proofs for 2 serious graphic books they were just about to publish. One of them was on the history of philosophy, heretics, and the other one was a
philosophy. Wow.
Yeah, and the other one was a problem in physics, right? So these were 2 books that they were just publishing, and I looked at them and I thought, wow, this is not cartoonish. I mean, it is cartoons, but it's certainly a serious book, and I thought this is something new. It's a thing. I didn't know it was a thing to do serious graphic books. And I started bumming around in bookstores and looking, and sure enough, MIT Press, other kinds of serious presses were publishing these kinds of books. And there's one in anthropology that came out. It's called Lissa, Lissa, by Shirin Hamdi and Coleman Nye. And it's about Egypt, right? So it's about someone who gets cancer in Egypt. They're medical anthropologists. So it's a new way of presenting your ethnography.
Yeah. I like to get a quote from the book, and it's a scene in the book. And then I'll just ask a question about your article in American Interest. Here's the quote. We would better keep this conversation to ourselves. Being in a leftist group is like being in a tekke, that is Muslim dervish lodge. You do whatever the sheikh wants. You think what he wants you to think. Don't let anyone know you have these questions, Nurai. Remember the saying, do as I say. If not, you're a traitor. This reminded me of your article in the American Interest a few years ago, where you challenged these simple dichotomies like Islamism versus secularism, and you explained the shared authoritarian culture and the reporters such as Kahraman, the selfless hero, and traitor. So could you please elaborate on this? You did already with the kaleidoscope, but could you please?
Yeah. So that was one of the patterns that I found, regardless of who was being interviewed, right? It could be left, right, it could be anything. Um, there, when you join a group, you have it becomes your life, right? It becomes your life, and it's organized around a central person. The leftists call them the abi, and the central person controls everything. You know, you used to. It's everyone knows who knows anything about the 70s that you could tell who was leftist and who was rightist by the shape of their mustache, like even down to that kind of detail, what they wore, how they interacted with the opposite sex. It was very controlled. What they believed. There's a scene in the book where the author, one of the characters discovers that there are different ways of looking at this ideological stuff. There are different ways of being a socialist, and tries to talk to his leader about it, his abi, and gets sort of slapped down. Who he says, "I tell you what to read." Um, how do you react to that? So there's this central figure who controls everything, and the important thing is to have loyalty and obedience. Those are the two most important things: loyalty and obedience. As for your talents in any other way, they really aren't that important. And I did some more research since that article about that, because it was very powerful. There's an article called Spindle Autocracy that I published a couple of years ago that came out of this. And there I developed this further, where I don't know, people might not know what a spindle is. It's like a stick that hangs on a string and it twirls. You use it in the villages to create yarn, wool out of raw wool. So the raw wool gets, networked around this spindle, and then comes out at the bottom as socially useful yarn that can be used to knit sweaters. There's a good word in Turkish for that, terbiye. Terbiye edilir, right? So that word has many connotations. You use it in food, you use it with children to make them behave. Well-behaved child is terbiyeli, but it also has a little sense of violence in there. You beat the food, to terbiye, the meat. So it's like you take these raw recruits and they gather in a network around a leader. The leader, the leader. Basically, they network around the leader, and they're expected to be loyal and obedient to the leader. But what happens is, because this is the essence of their relationship, right? Because it's personal. Loyalty and obedience is a personal relationship. If anybody disagrees with the leader, it's also personal. And then you're cast out as the traitor, right? If you disagree with the leader, who's often represented as this sort of heroic figure, the kahraman, then you get kicked out and you become the hain, the traitor. And the kahraman traitor duo of the terms is so widespread and so important in Turkish society. I see them as kind of spools around which much of Turkish political and social life, organize themselves, because it goes along with, because it's all personal, it goes along with this hatred, this really, really deep hatred that a number of the people who I interviewed brought out to me. They said, like, where does this come from? it's nefret. It's not just disliking somebody. It's really you just want to kill them. Um, and that could be someone who was in your group, right? Who you had a falling out. In some cases, someone in another group that you are ideologically identical puts a poster over someone else's poster, and then they have these violent feuds over that where people get killed. And it's about masculinity also.
So
And
at this point, it could be even from your someone from your ideological spectrum. You said compared to rightists in the book, I realized that leftists appear to be most divided in terms of the stories and in terms of how they got into violence against each other. Why don't we see the same dynamic on the right side?
Mm. Yeah, I've thought about that. I don't have a simple answer. The right did have splits. There were, I think, around 20 groups by the time of the coup, but there were like 70 different groups of leftists. And the rightists were divided according to the people who thought that the Central Asian kind of heroic warrior background is the most important aspect of being Turkish. And then there were those who thought Islam was the most important aspect. But they overlapped. They didn't really contradict one another. It was a matter of emphasis. So, and they had one focus, which was the leftists. Whereas the leftists were focused on each other as well, competing for, crumbs of power over particular neighborhoods and so on. So, I don't really know. They had the same goals, the left and the right, which was basically to overthrow the government, the overthrow whatever was there, either with the People's Revolution or with a kind of military coup that would end that would basically bring back a kind of authoritarian spindle based society. There was a romanticization on the right of um, the family with a central figure, the father, who had to be obeyed and respected. Um, there had to be loyalty. Um, and again, is sort of all of these images are used by politicians, including today, to create this kind of heroic father figure who you should obey. There's no sense that citizens have rights to demand things. The whole emphasis is on obedience and loyalty to whoever your heroic father figure is. There's also on the right, which is shared by the left and the right? But on the right, there was there was also a nostalgia for Islamic culture, not necessarily Islamism or any kind of political Islam, but Islamic culture as kind of a touchstone of civility. And that went along with small business, the kind of um, sanctity of business, right? That these were all kind of related in a kind of society where there was order. The thing that keeps being thrown out by the government, regardless of which government, is that if you don't follow us, you have chaos. If you follow us, you have order. So this is what order is, right? It's some version of the spindle autocracy with a central leader. And what's interesting about that is it seems as if these are strong men, because the spindle remains, right? It's always there. You can, Menderes, Deniz Gezmiş, there are these heroic figures, but around them, their networks coalesce and then split. So the other pattern, if you look away from the spindle, the other pattern is continual fracturing, and continual fracturing into groups that despise each other. Right? So a lot of societies have um, fracturing, and they have some we and you situations where you cooperate, and some us versus them where you're
Oh,
competing. But Turkey is unique, I think, at least in my experience, in that everything seems to be us versus them. Even in the business world, there's something going on there that I tried to kind of grasp with this spindle metaphor. Um,
so I'd like to ask you about the role of deep state or the Turkish state itself. What explains such level of violence, widespread, incredible violence as part of everyday life? Was it an incapacitated state, weak state, or was it a calculated, controlled violence that got states um, support in one way or another? So simply, as some suggest, we're the Turkish armed forces or Turkish intelligence agency complicit in these events.
hmm. So I I don't think we'll ever know. We don't know for sure. However, I did actually, after we spoke the last time, I went and looked through some old clippings, newspaper clippings I have from the 1980s that are around the time of the coup. And the officers who were interviewed for the newspapers said that they expressed one urgency because of all the horrible things that were happening. The government was completely unable to govern. They tried 84 times to elect a president that year and didn't manage to do it because they were so gridlocked. The inflation was around 100%. They um, they were as political leaders were being assassinated. Um, uh, there were there was what they called the military officers called the rise of terrorism, and they tried to get the government to do an anti-terror bill, but it couldn't manage to do that. And there were these liberated, so-called liberated areas appearing in Turkey, not just in the cities, where groups, controlled parts of the country or parts of the city, and they felt like the military officers that were interviewed said they felt like the government was losing control of the country, right? But they were reluctant to act. They said, if this is if there's any reason to have a coup, this is it. But we're reluctant to act because at that moment there was the Turkish economy was in terrible shape, in part because of uh, the um, it was the oil. I can't remember what it was called. Anyway, there was the price of oil was went up so high that Turkey could no longer afford anything abroad, including medicines or gasoline. So they couldn't afford to get gas into the trucks from the coal mines in Turkey to get coal to the capital. And so people were freezing. A friend of mine wrote after I left that in Ankara, she was putting her oranges into the refrigerator so they wouldn't freeze, right? And people were burning their furniture and so on. So it was just, this is a moment where the military, according to what they said, thought that, if the government can't handle this, we need to step in. But they were reluctant because they thought Turkey needed the money from the West, right? They had loans, huge loans from the West, and they didn't want to jeopardize that by having a coup. So they were afraid of that. But they were also, one of them actually said, there's a quote by a high-ranking officer, that because the Turkish army is so dependent for its support on the United States, that they thought that they needed what was the exact word, they needed they needed a coup to be sanctioned by the US before they could do it, and they didn't think the US would agree. So this was about in March, several months before the actual coup. So none of that really sounds like the CIA orchestrated anything. The CIA is blamed in Turkey for every single thing. You know, if a ship worker falls off a ship, must be the CIA. I mean, I'm not kidding. That actually was the suggestion of one of the ministers some years ago. So, you know, I it doesn't sound like the military was really happily, you know, causing chaos in order for them to take over. And many of these news articles also pointed out how relieved people were when the coup happened. And you know, it was such a terrible situation in every possible way that I can't imagine that people, except the people being hunted down by the military, of course, you know, wouldn't feel some relief at just the violence stopping and some new thing, you know, a new government, new chance to move ahead.
Toward the end, the book reveals the main characters' children who experience the current reality in Turkey and their perspectives about life. Could you please say a few words on this?
Well, we actually planned to just write about and draw about the 1970s with Ergun Gündüz, who, of course, is my collaborator in this. Who, you know, I have the vision and he puts the vision on paper.
Yeah, we sent our kudos to him. It was
Yeah, he was fantastic. He had to teach me how to actually do a you know, the scenario for one of these things. It's not at all like academic writing. Anyway, so well, I'm sorry, what was the question there?
So the generation, you know, their children.
Yeah. So we plan to end with the 70s, but the readers, they're all anonymous readers at the Princeton University Press, wanted us to bring it up to the present. So that presented a bit of a dilemma since, you know, we don't have any data on the present. Almost all the stories, in fact, all the stories in the book in the 70s are real stories. Either people told me the stories or I lived through those stories myself. But you know, if you're going to bring it up to the present, then you have to invent people. Then at that point, the book became true fiction. And it was Ergun's idea to give the main characters children, because then we could, you know, so he drew the children and I wrote their stories. So their stories are there, you know, and I tried to incorporate into the stories all the things that had changed since 1980 that would have affected them. So it's not predictable, you know, that a person who was a white an MHP person in the 70s would now have a rightist child. The categories have transformed and changed, and the concerns, and it's been globalized, and you know, it's not the same kind of generation as in the 70s. And then we have Gezi Park, where two of the children appear in Gezi Park. And then I ended there.
Yeah, I loved it. I loved it.
Because the children have their own stories, right? And the stories will continue. They have been shaped by other forces. And it's actually also interesting that at the point of the present, when two of the characters meet again by accident decades later and tell their, you know, what happened to you, it becomes full color. It's like that, you know, post 1980 full color. It's such a different feeling. And whereas before that, it's black and white or sepia, except for the blood, which is red.
Yeah, finally, I like to ask about the future. In the past few years, Turkey once again is witnessing an extraordinary violence and state violence. I can think of torture, kidnappings, and mafia-based violence, violence against women and such. So seeing the country's direction, many observers of Turkey getting worried day by day, becoming hopeless. Does your book help us to foresee the future?
Good question. I don't think anyone can foresee the future because, as I said at the beginning, it's contingent, right? Who knows what will happen to push it off in one direction or another. One of the interesting things about the present is that for a sociologist like yourself or an anthropologist like me, it's really hard to figure out what's going to happen next, because the sociological indicators that we have always relied on aren't really the factors that will make a difference anymore, I don't think, because of the way the political system has changed so that everything is in the hands of one man, right? It's not just the political system even is kind of hollowed out in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a question as to whether Parliament really has any say, and very much say in anything. As somebody posted on Twitter a copy of a decision that had been made in, I think, 2018 that I had never heard of, which, it actually showed the legal document, a political document that said that the president can withdraw from any international agreement just alone without consulting Parliament. NATO, the Istanbul Agreement. So there are these blockages to seeing into the future now. We know what we have now, but we don't know how it will develop, because we don't know what that one person is going to decide. And President Erdogan can turn on a dime. He has made unpredictable decisions before. So there are elections coming up, which he and the MHP apparently cannot win, but he can't afford to lose. There are many more guns around than there were even in the 1970s. I think, I don't have an exact count, but now there are these kind of armed militias. They're all wild cards as far as I'm concerned. And there's one other thing, that in the 1970s, you knew who your enemy was. You could just look down there and see the mustache, or you knew who belonged to what group, even if you were friends and you had been friends. You knew that he had split off and joined this other group, therefore it was your enemy. Now, you don't know who your enemy is, which makes it so much more dangerous and hard to figure out. So there are all these new categories, FETÖ'cü, PKK is an old category, but so there are combinations. People are encouraged to snitch on each other. That appears in one of the children's stories. And so you have people with vendettas, right, or gripes about their neighbors or their mother-in-law, who turn them in and label them with some group affiliation, which really has nothing to do with that person, right? So you don't know who is an enemy. It could be you, right? If you ruin your neighbor's lawn or something. So if there is violence, who is it going to be against? Where are the boundaries? The boundaries, I think, are always moving. Somebody who's on one side is suddenly on the other side. Someone who's in good with the leader is suddenly not good with the leader. It's the spindle politics working, splitting on the basis of disloyalty, personal anger, and so on. So that where you get that big emotion that I talked about before. But now it's diffused throughout society. And despair also is a big emotion. And I don't know how these things will work out.
On this note, which is not the best hope note, I know, but Jenny, thank you so much for taking time for this interview. Truly appreciate this. And for our audience, please stay tuned for our upcoming talks on great books at the House of Wisdom. Jenny, thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It was a great pleasure.
Absolutely.